I have a word on my tablet that's going to come up later in the testimony. If you have binoculars, you can see it. But the word is cynicism, and that will be a big part. Not the biggest, but it'll be a big part. But this one word, I have always struggled with having words at the tip of my tongue. Words that I use sometimes often the words that I use the most. And so what I learned to do, even back when I was a kid, even as young as 10, 11, and 12 years old, I learned to write down certain words that I knew that were trouble points for me. To not just remember, but also pronounce. And this is where it starts at 12 years old. I became a Christian at 12 years old. And I remember that well. And I remember it was as if the world was fresh and new. When I looked, the colors were better. Everything was better. The way I perceived the world, but that's where oftentimes when the devil loses you, that's when the things and the attacks begin. I was a different type of child. They didn't know it then that I was in special education all the time through my education up through when I graduated. But they didn't know it at the time, but I was on the autism spectrum. They knew that I was different. My parents had all types of tests run on me from experts. And they said that he's autistic-like, but he is not severe enough to be considered autistic. Well, you strike that many years later, they came up with a term for that in the 90s called Asperger's. Well, now Asperger's is not a term, it's you're just on the autism spectrum. So, as you can imagine, growing up, I had a lot of struggles because deep down I knew that I was different. And I would struggle in school, even in the special ed classes, with relating to other children and relating to everybody around me. I would struggle desperately trying to understand what all this means, what people's voice inflections meant. Even people looking at me when they talked to me was painful. And I didn't understand all of that. And I began to become more increasingly frustrated through my teen years. And then one of the things with children on the autism spectrum is that they love order. And in many ways, sometimes they're very passive. And in this world, there are many men and women who are ready to take advantage of that passiveness. And that's all I will say with that. And so you can imagine through my teen years, all these things coming together, I became increasingly angry, frustrated at a world that I did not understand. And I remember the first drink that I took. I began in my older teenagers, middle to older teenagers, I began to drink very heavily, trying to drown that out. And in my late teen years, I began to use hallucinogenics on top of that. And I was trying to drown those things out. And then in doing that, I began to see another possibility. I began to experiment in the occult. And I delved deeper into that. All of this was trying to make sense of a world because I lived in a secret world that I could not I didn't know how to relate to people. I didn't know how to tell people that this hurt or I don't understand this. I could not explain myself. And so actually everything looked normal. Everyone thought that I was this kid that had it all together in a way, but I was just acting it out because I didn't know how to do any differently. And so with those things that I was abusing myself with, that I had already mentioned, I began to go deeper into the occult. Except in my 20s, I remember in 1989, I had an experience with the occult. Now you're looking at someone that already had PTSD, and it was so buried that no one knew, because I didn't even know how to relate that to the world negatively. It was a prison. Well, the occult, it was seen powerful. It was alluring. And here is something that I had a sense of something and mystery that I could understand. And I got deeper. But I had an experience in late 1989 that absolutely horrified me. To a degree, it was so severe. It was a spiritual experience. And don't ever want to let you tell you different. Occultism is spiritual. But it was so horrific that my PTSD exploded. And I could no longer hide it. And I turned back. I said, Lord, what have I done to myself? What have I done? And so the Lord allowed me, in His grace, to see that world for what it really was. There was no hiding it. Oftentimes people that aren't His children, they go deeper into that world and they see it as an angel of light. But when you can see it for what it really is, it can be catastrophic. But I will say that in His grace, He allowed me to see that, because I would not have stopped if I would have kept seeing what I was seeing, the alluring part. So the 90s was spent unraveling all my pain, all my heartache. I know I've joked with some friends that I could have been, in those days, I could have been a poster boy for the American Psychiatric Institute. Good Christian counseling, unraveling things. And that's when I began to learn that about this thing called the autism spectrum. And I began to learn that I was different, not less. But then something else reared. As I was growing in the faith, let me preface this. One of the things when I was a teenager that was also catastrophic is I got a hold of some books from a hyper-legalistic standpoint in my early teens. And I had been raised with these scriptures and raised with this concept of grace. But in the hyper-legalistic approach in these books that I read, I didn't know enough about the faith to defend what little I knew against what these books said. And so I read them. I couldn't reconcile away from that hyper-legalistic approach. And this caused things to just get worse and worse. I subjected myself to wrong authorities within legalistic churches because I thought that's what you were supposed to do. I subjected myself to legalistic ideals. I began to realize that I was this horrible, sinful worm. And I couldn't reconcile that from the scriptures that they were using and the logic that they were using. And that's some of the deadliest traps we can find ourselves, when lies are sprinkled with a little bit of truth. Lies are sprinkled with truth. Just enough truth where you can't see the lies. And that was another catastrophic thing to lead to so much heartache. Well, the 90s were spent unraveling not just the hurt and pain of all the things that happened to me in my childhood and teen years, was also unraveling the legalism. And I started becoming angry and cynical towards the church and all these things that I saw. And I would sit here and I would think, I couldn't enjoy anything. I began to get to where in the 90s, late 90s, mid-late 90s, I began to reverse. I would see people go to church camps and they would come back, and for 2 or 3 weeks they were on a spiritual high and everything was great. But then they would go back to where they were before, and the excitement's over. And then I would see this Christian or that Christian or this leader or that leader fall. And so I began to have this very cynical view of Christianity. Well, in the late 90s, I was sitting in a train station in Rome. There I am, full-blown cynical. And one of the poisons of cynicism is it has an appetite that cannot be quenched. It keeps grabbing, it keeps more and more, digging deeper, until where suddenly there's an arrogance of thinking, I'm the one that has it all figured out and everyone else is stupid. And that I had reached that point. Well, I remember I was in a train station in Rome. Yes, over there contemplating all those things. The Lord knew what I needed. And I looked across, and there was a man from India, him and his wife, dressed in their Indian attire, pleasant looking. And I noticed that he would glance over in my direction, which made me wonder, what are they up to? I'm over in another country and I don't know this guy. Well, he comes over and he starts talking to me and asking me questions about things and where the direction to this place is or that. So we had a congenial conversation, and before long I began to realize that in his broken English, he was witnessing to me. And I remember oh boy, I still get choked up thinking about this dear, dear man. I began to realize he was witnessing to me. And when I realized that, I buried my head in my hands. And I said, Lord, forgive me. In my arrogance, I have lost sight of what you're about. And then he was concerned. He called his wife over and we began to talk. And it was a wonderful fellowship. And I remember we talked for 2 hours. And we parted ways, and I never saw them again. I will one day. Well, I began to thinking, Lord, thank you for healing me of my cynicism in such your unique way. Well, I was kind of healed. And as time went on through the 2000s, I began to become more cynical in dealing in different churches with legalism again, trying to make sense of it all, trying to help the others deal with legalism, trying to defend others against it. And I had almost reached this point again, not as poisonous as the time before, but I was on my way there. I'm the one that's got it figured out. Everyone else is stupid. And so strike it, move forward a decade and a half or so. I remember I was standing with a friend of mine, David Pomeroy, and it was a revival night at church. And I remember thinking, dumb revival, Everyone comes here and listens. Here's that cynicism. So the cynicism's a poison. Don't ever let it creep in. And I had heard that Ariel Barber had made a profession of faith. And I'm standing with David, and she comes around the corner with one of the ministers. And at that moment, I knew it was real. And that God was still doing his thing. And I was ashamed. Lord, forgive me for that poison. I saw something so real. And he says, Warren, I'm doing my thing in people's lives, and I want you to be a part of that resolution. Whatever you see in this world or in my church that's wrong, you be the difference. You be that one that can point people to Christ. Stop people watching. And that word cynicism has, in my earlier life, had been a defining moment. But one of the greatest battles after becoming a Christian was fighting against cynicism. And it's led me into the ideal, and it's been such a beautiful experience at the Haven. When you go to a church that believes that salvation is not just the end game, the kingdom of God is about the way we live our life as Christians. Yes, salvation is part of that. Oh my gosh, yes. And going to heaven and seeing Jesus is part of that. But that's not the only thing. No matter what happens or what I experience in life, the ideal is that I want to focus, and I hope that each one of us can, is focus on the mission that we have, is to bring the gospel to this world. To bring the gospel not only into this world, but even keep it within the church. That we are continuing bringing the ideal and the heart and mind of Christ as heaven on earth. We are part of that mission. Bringing heaven on earth. Showing people the only Jesus they may know. No matter what else is happening around me. And no matter who is falling. I want to be that Jesus. And I'm almost done here, speaking. And the one thing I want to share, another part of my testimony, is that I'm thankful to be a part of a church that believes that the mission of the Christian is to take part in showing the world the mind and heart of Christ, to take part in the kingdom mindset of bringing the gospel to this world, not just so people can be saved, but bringing that ideal of Jesus in heaven to this world, doing my part. And the Haven has been a haven. I came to this church not cynical, but I had a very jaded view of things because I had been exhausted and crushed by legalism. And I was very tired. And if nothing else made sense tonight, or this morning, what I've said, I began to learn real quick that this church and the fellowship within it is what the gospel's about. And that's something that I want to be a part of. And so here I did find a haven among beautiful brothers and sisters that have helped me heal from the scourge of legalism. I had tried so hard I had tried so hard to stand against it. And it will crush you. But you know what? Here I found healing, and my jaded nature become less. And so I want to thank my Haven family for being a part of the kingdom towards my life. And I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what the gospel's about. Bringing the kingdom to people's lives. And I have learned to do that in this fellowship on a deeper level, I hope, than I ever have before, because that deeper level has affected me from each one of you.